Jesus said, "Man cannot live on bread alone, but from every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." You're listening to Daily Truth.
Many in Old Testament Israel heard the gospel, even if only through types and shadows. But sadly, for many in Old Testament Israel, the gospel was never truly known. Like the psalmist, for many of us, our fathers have told us the precious promises of the gospel without ever truly knowing or believing these promises for themselves. It is a great tragedy when fathers pass down to their children what they have heard but never truly known. That is, fathers passing down to their children what they have heard but never believed. Look at verse 3. Things that we have heard and known that our fathers have told us. The author is saying, under the inspiration of the Spirit, coming off of the heels of verse 2, he is saying that there is something that has been spoken in a parable. There is something that is darkened, it's veiled, but it's a saying of old. There's this gospel, this ancient gospel that is veiled, and it is something that by God's grace, we, speaking of himself and his peers, his contemporaries who were the elect Israel, those who were redeemed, those who had spiritual eyes to see and spiritual ears to hear, he says, we have not only heard these things, heard these ancient sayings of old, but we have known them. We have comprehended them. Implicitly, what he's saying is that we have believed them, and we heard them from our fathers. Our fathers are the ones who told us. Now, we don't see the point that I'm making in verse 3, but we certainly see it in verse 8. Verse 8 says that we need to pass these things down, coming on the heels of verses 5, 6, and 7. We need to pass these things down to our children so that they might teach these things to their children, so that what? So that they should not be like their fathers. A stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. Here the author is speaking, he is referencing those of Israel who died out in the wilderness in their 40 years of wandering after being delivered and ransomed from Egypt, after passing through and being baptized in the Red Sea, after partaking of the Passover feast, after witnessing the 10 plagues upon Egypt and being fed by God and nourished by him with the manna that fell from heaven. After all of this, they still grumbled and complained. And the Bible is very clear that the root of their sin, their grumbling and complaining, were merely the symptoms of a deeper sin, which was the sin of unbelief. And that an entire generation, virtually, died out in their unbelief. They died out in the wilderness. They did not inherit the land or the promise. And so the psalmist is saying that we want to pass down. We have heard, but not only heard, but by God's grace, causing us to come alive by the power of his Spirit, we have not merely heard these dark or veiled sayings of old, the ancient gospel, but we have heard them and known them. We have comprehended these things. We have believed these things. And we must be diligent to teach these things to our children and our children's children, that it may be passed down generation to generation, so that we may not be like our fathers. Verse 8. A stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. Now, once again, the fathers spoken of in the context of our psalm today are the fathers in Israel, delivered from Egypt, ransomed out of slavery, who grumbled and complained in the wilderness and perished in unbelief. And yet, there is still a principle here that is relevant for you and for I. This does not apply to all of us, but for some of us, perhaps you grew up in a home where your parents were not believers. Perhaps you were raised in a house with parents who did not teach you the things of God, who rejected the gospel, who rejected the Christian tradition. Or perhaps for some of you, you were raised in a home that taught you Christian principles, perhaps even proclaimed to you, inconsistently albeit, but from time to time, the gospel. But they did not believe it themselves. It seems as though this is what the author is getting at in verse 3, that we have heard and known these things, and the only reason we've heard them and know them is because our fathers have told us. That's the end of verse 3. But later on, he goes on to say that these fathers ultimately rejected these things. That our fathers died in rebellion and in a stubbornness of heart. That our fathers grumbled and complained, and our fathers ultimately died in unbelief. So it's as though the progression, this chain, the links go something like this. We must be diligent to teach these things to our children so that they might teach them to their children. And we have heard, and not merely heard, but known these things. That is likened to believed these things because we heard them from our fathers. Our fathers told us, but the implication, if we cross-reference verse 3 with verse 8 of our text, the implication is our fathers told us these things because our fathers witnessed these things, but our fathers did not themselves believe these things. My point is this: it is possible, brothers and sisters, to be told the gospel from those who they themselves do not believe the gospel. This can happen in the biological family. This can happen within the household, but this can also happen, and I would argue, at a massive degree, with epidemic proportions, has happened not merely in individual households in America, but over the last recent decades has happened in the church in America. My point is this: I believe that there are many churches within evangelicalism today, and this has been the case, I believe, for several decades now, that have told the gospel, but those heralding the gospel, telling the gospel, these spiritual fathers passing down the gospel, proclaiming the gospel, are every bit as stubborn, with every ounce of a hardness of heart, as the spiritual fathers of Israel who died out in unbelief in the wilderness.
Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you would consider supporting Right Response Ministries, we'd be incredibly grateful. You can do so by going to rightresponseministries.com/donate to give your gift of any amount. If you're not able to support us financially, that's okay. You can still support us in a great regard simply by subscribing to our YouTube channel, clicking the bell, and of course sharing our content with all your friends and family. We can't do this without you, your support, and your prayers. So thank you.